That Triathlon Show 365. Hey, what's up everybody, and welcome back to another episode of That Triathlon Show, the podcast presented by scientifictriathlon.com. I'm your host Michael, and on today's episode I interview Andy Blow, founder of Precision Fuel and Hydration. Andy joins us to discuss the exact numbers of carbohydrate, fluid and sodium intake that Fenella Langridge, Crowley, Leon Chevalier, all top 10 in Kona, had in the Ironman World Championships, and also the numbers that Emma Pallant-Browne, who was third in the 7.3 World Championships in St. George, used in two very different races, especially in terms of environmental conditions, with Kona obviously being hot and humid and St. George being extremely cool and dry this year. Precision Fuel and Hydration is one of the sponsors for this episode. I'll keep this one short as we do have Andy on for the entire episode, but just a quick shout out to their Black Friday promo that is coming up, where there will be 20% off everything in store from Thursday the 24th of November until midnight on Cyber Monday. There's no code required. The discount is automatically applied site-wide on precisionfuelandhydration.com. And thank you to Roka. Roka produce exceptional quality triathlon wetsuits, tri-suits, swimskins, goggles, performance sunglasses, and prescription eyeglasses and sunglasses. If you want to go faster in the water, look to Roka's range of wetsuits. From the entry level to the top of the line wetsuits, all of them come with arms-up technology and exceptional quality and comfort in the water. Roka's tri-suits work perfectly together with the wetsuits, as they too come with arms-up technology to really maximize your shoulder mobility for the swim. And on the bike and run, they are optimized for aerodynamics and comfort. Roka's range of sunglasses and prescription glasses is also packed with innovation with patented technologies such as the Geeko anti-slip technology. They are ultralight and have excellent optical properties. Visit roka.com/TTS for 20% off your order. Now, without any further ado, here's my interview with Andy Blow. Welcome back to the Triathlon Show, Andy. How are you doing?
I'm good, Michael. How are you?
Yeah, I'm good, thank you. It's been a while since we last chatted, but there's been a lot of big racing going on, and you have some good and interesting case studies and other data observations from the big races that we've had recently with Kona and 7.3 Worlds in St. George. So let's chat about that. First of all, can you just run through the list of athletes you had in Kona that you're working with and that use your product and that you have kind of compiled data from?
Yeah, we were lucky enough to actually compile 11 case studies in total from athletes racing in Kona. And that was a big focus of what we wanted to do this year, because we felt that, Kona is such a big race and such a unique race from a hydration, especially about a hydration and fueling standpoint. It was a big goal of ours to crunch the numbers on a lot of athletes. So we focused on working with some of the pro athletes that are kind of ambassadors for the brand. So people like Leon Chevalier, Fenella Langridge, Crowley, all who actually, basically had really, really good races, all in the top 10. I mean, there were individual circumstances. I think Sarah felt like her race, she got a drafting penalty and felt like her race wasn't anywhere near perfect. But from our perspective, if we step back and say, like, to get case studies from 3 athletes who all finished in the top 10 was amazing. We've also got a couple of age group winners, and other top age group athletes who did well in the mix there. So we did feel like, as a group, we gained a lot of insight both into how those individuals executed fueling and hydration in Kona, but also big learnings from the group overall, because we can compare it to data we've got at other Ironman races and help answer athletes' questions about how you might adapt your fueling and hydration strategy for those harsh conditions in Kona.
Yeah, so maybe let's start with that, the group level learnings. How does the fueling and hydration in Kona compare to a more, let's say, standard Ironman race?
Well, I think the first thing to say is that people, as you'd expect, on the hydration side especially, take a lot more. That heat and humidity. I mean, I haven't been to Kona since 2004 when I raced there myself, and I went back this year to actually be there to see the races live. And even as a spectator, running around trying to get from place to place, it reminded me just how ridiculous the heat and humidity is. And I was, your shirt is, your t-shirt is like sticking to you all day long, and sweat's, in your eyes the whole time. So we know that fluid loss is massive. And in the group, what we saw with fluids is that although there was a difference, we saw some of the highest fluid intakes we've seen yet in Ironman competition. The highest one was actually worked out an average of about 1.5 litres per hour throughout the duration of the event. And we saw that was one of the age group athletes. We also saw Leon, who is one of the pros, taking in 1.3, nearly 1.4 litres per hour overall. And so it kind of started to push the envelope up for us as to what really high fluid volumes look like in these sort of events.
And this is something we have talked about in the past, about the absorption of fluid. And obviously the sodium content of the fluid and versus the blood plays a part in that. But we have also talked about maybe there is a certain limit to how much you can absorb. But would you say that these amounts, close to up to 1.5 liters an hour, that is still beneficial, or is it just like, is there a chance that some of that could be just unnecessary fluid that is not getting absorbed?
Yeah, it is a really good question. I would say in the case of, if we drill into Leon's one specifically, 1.3 litres an hour, which is high. It's not above what we've seen before, massively above, but it's right at the upper end. The interesting fact was, I'll have to double check this. I certainly don't think he peed on the bike. I don't think he maybe peed for the whole race. So in the one sense, you'd expect if you were putting in a big fluid overload that you would see people needing to pee or feeling uncomfortable. I think that Leon, so he did suffer a little bit of GI discomfort. But he still rated his GI comfort for the races like overall as 8 out of 10. There was a little bit of
8 out of 10 being a positive.
Sorry, so 10 out of 10 being like I had no trouble all day. I mean, he mentioned some issues on the bike in terms of, I think he was trying to hit some fairly high fluid numbers on the bike, and he felt that he was pushing those limits, but he didn't sort of go over them. And for us, that was interesting because the way we formulated the plan we know that Leon is a pretty heavy sweater. We know that he's a pretty salty sweater as well. So getting in a reasonable volume of fluid and sodium is always important for him in the heat. But what we discussed pre-race was that he uses concentrated bottles of carbs and electrolytes to get those kind of totals in. And then the idea was to supplement with as much or as little additional water as he felt like he needed to take. So he was being quite responsive to his needs. And he clearly, his decision-making on the day was that he needed a lot of fluid. And I haven't got accurate statistics on, and I can't vouch for the statistics on Sam Laidlow, who obviously came second, but I've seen Sam reporting on Instagram and in a podcast that he talked on about taking over 2 litres an hour on the bike, which does on the one hand sound really, really high. And if you'd have given me that number just off the cuff with no context, I would say that's unlikely to be correct. But having seen the fact that we've got athletes that were taking, over 1.5 litres an hour on the bike, where we're reasonably confident we can get close to verifying that number, then it suggests that, pushing the fluid intake high. Both Leon and Sam are athletes that did very, very well in the race. They both biked very, very strongly. Sam obviously has set the record for the bike split. And I think Leon, even with a minute penalty, was inside or close to the previous best bike split in Kona. They both ran well off the bike. So when you take all of that in together, the evidence doesn't suggest that consuming that level of fluid for those individuals in those conditions at that intensity was too much.
Yeah, absolutely. And one logistical question on that, for when you said that Leon, he consumes concentrated bottles with carbohydrates and electrolytes. Obviously, he's only carrying so many bottles from the start of the race. But are the bottles concentrated enough that basically lasts the entire 4 hours from him, and he can just supplement with additional fluid like water or maybe Gatorade or whatever is available on course? Because if you are relying on a certain amount of sodium in your bottles, then then sometimes on course, if you're a heavy sweater, I know this from personal experience, then you can't really find something that is the concentration that you would like to. Or is he perhaps even bringing some of your tablets or something like that with him on the bike? How does he do it logistically?
Yeah, I mean, it's actually, in one sense, it's relatively clear cut and simple with Leon. He tends to carry, so he'll have 2 1-litre bottles on the bike, with both of which contain a number of energy gels, some water, and some pH 1500 electrolyte. So they're extremely concentrated with both carbohydrate and sodium. Then he'll also have a 500 ml bottle with that in as well. So basically 2.5 litres of capacity with predominantly energy, sodium with a little bit of water. And then on top of that, he's largely picking up plain water. So according to our stats, he picked up around about 4.7 litres of plain water during the race from the aid station. So his routine at the aid station was pretty simple. It was going for water only. And I think with pro athletes, you can, especially those that are riding close to 4 hours, it becomes easier for them to conceivably do that because they haven't got to carry enough calories or whatever for 5, 6, or even 7 hours, as some people might be out on the bike for. So it's something we're seeing more commonly with the athletes at the front. It also it goes back to the thing that is important for a lot of athletes, which is controlling the controllables. It allows them to know exactly if they finish those bottles, and that, as you well know, and this is true of good age group athletes as well, they're able to predict their finish time on the bike to within a few minutes normally if things go to plan. And therefore working out, if you know you've got to hit, for example, 100 grams of carbohydrate an hour, you think you're going to be on the bike for 4 hours, it's very simple. You need to carry about 400 grams of carbs. We'd always encourage someone to carry a little bit more than what they expect they'll need in case they find themselves needing more. And also there's the reality of the fact that if you dump 90 grams of carbohydrate in a gel into a water bowl, and do you really expect to like drain that to the absolute bottom and be able to get everything out of it? It's like not always. So we'd usually say, okay, if you want to hit 400, maybe let's take 430, 440 in total to allow sort of 10% for a bit of drift. But increasingly, that's the way we're seeing the pro athletes do it. And it takes the pressure off them then having to pick up special needs bags or get certain items from aid stations.
Yeah. Maybe let's just run through the numbers of Fenella Langridge, Sarah Crowley, and Leon in terms of carbohydrates, fluid, and sodium intake, just to get an overview of those three. Take it from whichever athlete you want to start with.
Well, let's start with Leon because we've been talking about him. If we start with all three of them, we'll talk about fluid. So Leon's fluid per hour was about 1.38 litres per hour on average. Fenella's was about 1.1 litres per hour, which given Fenella's body size, Fenella's only about 55, 56 kilograms compared to Leon's nearly 70 kilograms, 68 kilograms. That's a pretty high fluid intake, but we know that Fenella has a pretty high sweat rate. What's interesting then is you look at Sarah, who's also probably a similar weight to Fenella, but who only had 593 milliliters of fluid per hour. So basically half of what Fenella took and less than half what Leon took. But that for us, because we've got a depth of data on those athletes from a number of races now, we don't see that as uncharacteristic. Sarah seems to be able to race on significantly less fluid than some other athletes that we're working with. She always has. And
does that correlate with her just having a low sweat rate in training, or is it like, does she sweat half as much as Fenella, for example, or is the difference much smaller than that?
It's a good question, and one that I wish I could give you a really accurate answer to, but certainly my perception, we've got some sweat rate testing data from all of those athletes, but the nature of sweat rate testing data is that it's very specific to the intensity and the conditions that you do it in. So you unless you get three athletes and compare them in exactly the same conditions, same intensity, it's really hard to make a direct comparison. But I would certainly say that subjectively, yes, Sarah has a lower sweat rate, significantly lower sweat rate than the other two, and therefore and has tended. Leon and Fenella are both proving to be adept at racing in hot conditions, but Sarah's got a much longer track record of doing well in hot conditions. And one question I need to talk to the athletes about and start to unpick myself is that, okay, well, we know there's big individual differences, and you'll never know the full extent of this. But if Sarah can do this on what is close to 600 milliliters of fluid an hour, as you rightly said, Leon took 1.3. Is that excessive? How would he have fared at 1.1 litres or 1 litre? I'm pretty confident that at 600 millilitres, he would have been too dehydrated. We know from past experience he's tended to need more fluid than that. But how big is that window that he can tolerate, and how close is he to the upper limit versus the lower limit of that is a kind of a question that hopefully we refine over time with more experience.
Yeah. What about sodium intake for these three athletes?
Sodium intake, again, if I do that in terms of two things, we can do it as relative sodium concentration and absolute. And if we start with the absolute amounts, Leon took about 920 milligrams of sodium per hour. Fenella took about 1,300 milligrams per hour, and Sarah took just 230 milligrams per hour. And again, there's two factors at play there. There's the fact that, so if we'd expect Sarah to take less sodium significantly than the two for two reasons. One is because her sweat sodium concentration is lower, so she's losing a net amount of sodium less than the others, but also because she's taking in less fluid, there's less of a requirement to be aggressive with the fluid, with the sodium intake, because the ratio of those two is more likely to be in balance. A low amount of fluid intake only requires a low amount of sodium intake to keep everything in balance. As you scale your fluid intake, you need to scale your sodium intake up as well to as it meets a bigger percentage of your total losses. And so both Fenella and Leon are significantly saltier, and they've learned to take more sodium as a result. So what's interesting there is when we look at the relative sodium concentrations, Leon was at just under 700 milligrams per litre because of the amount of plain water he drank, whereas Fenella was up at 1,100 milligrams per litre. Sarah was at just under 400 milligrams per litre. So that sort of brings those numbers. It's a way of pulling the numbers together a bit more because it's related to the amount of fluid they took.
Yeah. And how do those numbers compare to, I'm sure that you have test data for sweat sodium concentration, and the good thing about that is that it's not very specific to conditions, but more quite stable, as we have talked about before. So what are these athletes' sweat sodium concentrations when you've tested them?
So Leon's is usually around about 1,300 milligrams a litre. Fenella's is very similar, actually, around 1,300. And Sarah's tends to be way, way lower, like around 500. So again, the strategy for them is obviously tailored and seems to fits with their relative losses. The slight outlier on this example is that if we were designing it, if we were redesigning it, we'd have probably looked at Leon potentially taking a little bit more, in the sense that his replacement was about 50% of his losses. Now, it feels like that might, he had an excellent result, and he raced really strongly to the end. So one part of the argument there could be that, well, he got it about right, because I believe he did. I believe that my feeling is, though, that he was probably slightly on the lower side of what was optimal, rather than pushing the upper end of that for him. Sarah's seems about right for her based on past experience, and Fenella was at she was replacing, actually, in terms of relative concentration. Obviously, she didn't drink as much as she sweated, but relative concentration, she was almost at 1-to-1, which is quite high. So, but then when you look at the subjective ratings that all of these athletes gave around their sort of hydration and how they felt it went on the day, Leon rated his hydration his overall hydration as 10 out of 10. He said it, felt like he got it right. Fenella said that she rated hers as 8 out of 10, And she said mainly the dissatisfaction, if that was creeping in, was more to do with apprehension about making some last minute changes because she'd not raced in those conditions before. Sarah said that despite the fact, in absolute terms, when you look at it, she only took 600 mils an hour and 400 milligrams per litre of sodium. She said 10 out of 10, she nailed it and felt like she got it her best ever. So I would chalk all three of those up as like successful strategies on the day. It's just then a case of, what can we learn from them going forward? And is there anything we'd change in same circumstances going into the future?
Yeah, but it's interesting, and this is something that I have seen as well from a coaching perspective, that there is a wide range, or can be a wide range between individuals for how much relative sodium concentration you need to be successful, to have a successful hydration strategy, with Leon being more like 50% of his losses, and then Fenella and Sarah being much closer to Fenella being maybe 80% or so, and Sarah quite close to 100%. But one thing to keep in mind there, I would say, for the listeners, is that Leon's time was under 8 hours.
Yeah, absolutely.
And if you're an age grouper and you're doing this race in 14 hours, then every hour your net or your absolute net losses are going to be bigger. So even if you might be able to, half distance race, get by with a 50% replacement rate, then if you're out there for longer, then there might come a point where you need a higher replacement rate. So it's not just about there's no one number, but it depends on the duration that you're out there, because I've found that the absolute losses that you accumulate over a day, or whether it's a half distance race or a training day or a full distance race, that also comes into play, even though it's hard to quantify like where is that point, and it probably varies very much from individual to individual.
Absolutely. And I think what we know as well is that when you isolate a variable and look at it and try and attribute, success or otherwise in a race to it, it's an impossible task, because there's so many complex things that are going on in the body, that what you can say for sure is that all three of these athletes achieved something very close to their best possible performance on the day. So if you zoom out and look at their hydration strategy as an isolated thing, what you have to be able to say from these numbers is that they weren't a million miles off it being, they were in the zone, which allowed them to compete fairly optimally. What their hydration strategy certainly didn't do was cause a catastrophic failure or compromise their performance.
Yeah. What about carbohydrate intake?
Carbs was interesting. So if I jump back to the overall stats just really quickly to give you an insight there, we saw that the pros on average, and these are all pros obviously, consumed about 22% more carb per hour than the age groupers that we looked at. But even with the age groupers, the median carb intake across the group was 85 grams per hour, which is significantly higher than we would typically see at most Ironman races. Now, the speculation there is obviously you can make lots of, you can attack that from a lot of different angles, but it's a championship race where people have qualified. They are, in essence, some of the better athletes. I think the average finishing time of our cohort across men and women was close to 9.5 hours. So this is a genuinely pretty elite group of athletes. And so you'd expect a high level of carbohydrate intake. From everything that we understand from the evidence out there, is that higher level of carb intake supports a higher level of output. And these guys and girls are obviously at the highest end of the output. But I was quite impressed with that, 85 grams an hour being an average. Trying to see if I've got the range to hand. So the lowest carb intake was at 66 grams an hour, and the highest was 120 grams an hour across the group. So both of those actually pretty much exist within the broadest range of what you would say would be optimal for that race. Because more than 60 grams an hour you'd always expect, and we definitely are hearing lots of stories about people doing up to 120 grams or maybe a little bit more per hour. So it kind of really covers that range. For the three athletes we're talking about specifically, Leon did a solid job at 105 grams an hour. Fenella did brilliantly at 96 and Sarah was at 70. And again, if I was to characterize that based on previous races, Leon's been working hard over the last 18 months to get his intake up a little bit, but he's always been someone who's pushed a lot of carbohydrate and been able to tolerate it. So 105 is right. I think he's done a bit more in some races and a bit less in others, but that's in the zone. Fenella is definitely someone who's managed to get that intake up significantly over time. So 96 grams an hour for her was fantastic and really, I think, helped to support an aggressive race. She was out front a lot of the day. And if you're going to race out front, you are going to burn more calories. So she was doing that. And again, with Sarah did a solid job at 70 grams. But like with her fluid intake, Sarah's always appeared to be someone who can race towards the lower end of the recommendations. And so it's unusual to see her taking in significantly more than that. And whether there's more performance that could be unlocked by doing so is for debate, but I would say probably questionable, because with an athlete of Sarah's experience and track record, she's very in tune with her body. So I think that something in the lower end of that optimal range probably suits her best.
Yeah. And across these three variables, carbohydrates, fluid, and sodium, did all three athletes that we're talking about here, did they pretty much nail what their plan was before the race, or were there any things that differed from the pre-planned expectations?
No, they were all, I would say, pretty much in the zone. The one that we were less confident about making strong recommendations on for this race were, and we don't like to really make target fluid volumes anyway because they're so variable, but we were a little bit unsure, which is why we had chats with most of the athletes to say, look, around the have a base amount of fluid and sodium we're trying to get in, but then supplement with water as you feel you need to, because the good thing at Kona is and a lot of these races, there's no shortage of water available on the course. So they were taking advantage of that, and I think that was where we saw maybe what we'd have done in the future is push Leon's sodium intake up a little bit, knowing now that he's likely to consume a bit more plain water with it. But other than that, I would say that the all three of them appeared to execute a plan that was, really, really strong. The other thing to mention, which we often see with these people that race really well and are strong to the finish, is that all three of them did a really good job on keeping their calorie intake up deep into the marathon, which, as you know, as someone who's raced long races, is really, really hard to do, especially if you're struggling, especially when you're getting a bit dehydrated and it's hot. And the sort of will to keep pushing calories in can deteriorate deep into the race. But we definitely saw these guys, eating and drinking deep into the marathon. And there was a lot of action at the back end of the race. Leon went backwards, I think, to 9th at one point, but then came surging through and almost caught Keenlay before the line because he was moving forward strongly again in the final mile or so. So that's something that I like to reinforce to age group athletes, is that it can be very, very tempting to let your intake taper off, especially if you're not having a great race, as you sort of lose a bit of will and lose a bit of heart later on. But if you can keep your energy intake up, it's more likely that you'll rally and have a strong finish.
Yeah. That leads me to a question there. Did these athletes have a fairly even intake across the bike and the run, or like relatively even, or what did anybody have a big difference where they kind of took a lot on the bike, and then the run they still took on carbohydrate, but to a lesser rate than they did on the bike? How did the distribution between bike and run look?
Yeah, so Leon did a pretty typical thing where he front loaded on the bike. So he was up at nearly 140 grams an hour on the bike, and something around 80 grams an hour on the run, which is pretty typical, both for him and what we'd expect to see with people being able to front load it. I'm seeing if I've got to hand the numbers on Fenella. I think I'd have to go back and double check, but I think that Fenella's was a little bit more even across the two. But I'm not entirely sure. I'd have to double check that. And with Sarah's, I'd have to dig into the numbers to give you any sort of clarity on that. But I would say with Leon, we know it's a typical habit for him, and one that we've encouraged with him is to try to get more energy in on the bike to set up a good run, and that's what he appeared to do.
Yeah, 140 grams an hour for 4 hours is very impressive.
It's solid, yeah.
And can you walk us through the process of how these athletes come up with their nutrition and hydration strategy for Kona or any race reel? Like, what is the process that they go through?
It starts with us. If they work with us on it, then we try to act as advisors and act as a sounding board, but not to dictate. We don't want to be. Most of these athletes, especially if we start working with an athlete who's already a pro or is an aspiring pro, an up and coming athlete, they're clearly doing a lot of things right already. So we like to give them advice on taking what they're currently doing and modifying it to make it better, rather than saying, unless we feel that their strategy is really letting them down, then that's the approach we'll take. So usually what it is, it's to focus on getting them to understand what are the likely numbers that they want to hit. So if we take Leon's case, if he wants to hit 140 grams an hour on the bike and he wants to hit 80 grams an hour on the run, then what we'll do is we'll say, right, you've got our product range here. Like, how do you prefer to do that? A great case in point there is that, she wasn't racing in Kona, but Emma Pallant-Browne is just not. She's always said she's just not as big a fan of using gels as using an energy drink or using energy chews. She just doesn't get on well with gels, the texture and that sort of thing. She'll use them at a push, but doesn't really prefer it. So we would be silly to give her a plan the same as Leon, where he predominates on taking gels in bike bottles on the bike. So the process really is like hone in on what we think the number should be. If we're talking carbohydrates, and it's usually then it's looking at what they're currently doing. We'll analyze a couple of races where we've not had some input, and we'll say, do we feel like that number is good where it is? Does it need to go up a bit, or does it need to come down a bit? And then we'll make a suggestion on roughly what that number should be. We'll do similar for the run, and then really we ask the athlete to come back to us and sort of like present the plan. Here's how I'm going to do it. This is how I've calculated it. I'm going to carry it in these bottles. I'm going to carry this many gels on the run, or use these at the aid stations, or we'll help them with figuring out what's in the products like Gatorade or Morton gels or whatever is available on the course. So if they plan to pick nutrition up, they can do it. But we fundamentally ask them to present the plan to us in some way. That could be as a voice note or a written thing, or if some of them are very organized with this, like Leon will typically send us either a list or a spreadsheet with it on. And then what we'll do is we'll check the maths and check the numbers to make sure that it all adds up. And we'll take that and we'll compare it to previous races that we've got data on that are either in similar conditions, or where, if we've not got similar conditions, where we can extrapolate it up or down based on heat and things like that. And then we'll make any advisory comments around whether we feel it's good to go, or whether things should be done differently. So we try and make it a collaborative process led by the athlete, rather than us just telling them what to do. Because I think ultimately you get better long-term learning outcomes if people take responsibility for that. And really it boils down to like understanding the numbers, understanding how those numbers might differ for different durations and different conditions, and then moving them up and down. So to make that real, as a concrete example, Leon came to us before Kona and modeled his plan off what was successful for him at Ironman Mallorca. So it was essentially similar on the carbohydrates, with an upward adjustment on the fluid and sodium because of the expected higher sweat losses. And that's what you tend to see athletes do is, once they feel like they've honed in on something like a successful routine, it's obviously then repeat with small tweaks each time.
Yeah. I was going to get to that with the hydration part. How much do you remember off the top of your head? How much did he tweak the hydration intake compared to Mallorca?
It was just, I couldn't give you a percentage number. I'd have to go back and actually look at those things, but it would have been a small increase, a small hourly increase in the amount of sodium on the expectation that he was going to pick up more water, basically. One of the things we want to work on in the future is doing some testing. We've actually been talking to a PhD student that we're helping at the University of Bedfordshire, who's researching sodium and fluid intake in ultra endurance. And one of the questions that we're trying to ask is, okay, can we take athletes and model what their sweat losses are in a thermoneutral environment, say 20 degrees Celsius indoors on a bike trainer, ramp them up to 30 degrees and high humidity to replicate a tough race in the heat? And can we do that with enough people to get an idea of, is there a kind of scaling factor that we can use to estimate increases in sweat loss that might help us point to how much more fluid you might need to take? So that's something that we're aware that, we'd like to be better at, because not everyone can go and train and compete in the kind of race conditions that they might be exposed to, and therefore have to make some guesses and some leaps of faith.
Yeah. But to sum up your answer to that question, it's basically you're looking at they based the plan for an upcoming race on what has worked in a recent race or previous races, and like all of the experience collected, not necessarily on having just grabbing a number like I should be taking in 120 grams per hour of carbohydrate, or I should be taking in 1 liter per hour of fluid on the bike, but it's tweaking based on previous experiences. So is that a fair assessment?
Absolutely. And that's why we tried to pre-gather data from an athlete, or try to get them to do some recollection with us when we start working with them, because we always feel like there's a reason why they've done what they've done in the past, and we need to unpick what those reasons are and see how successful it's been. But evolving a currently moderately good strategy into a really good strategy is better than trying to wipe a slate clean some of the time.
Yeah. And let's say for next year for Kona, if obviously Sarah has raced Kona many times, but for Leon and Fenella, if they go back there, would you assume that they will maybe base their plan on what worked in Kona this year, because it's such a specific climate, rather than what they've done in other Ironman races closer to the World Championships next year?
Yeah, I would say that's likely at this point, unless, of course, things change in the meantime, in terms of if we learn anything. We know that things like carbohydrate tolerance moves a little bit, and we wouldn't persist with 140 grams an hour on the bike for Leon if he did it in numerous other races and actually found it to be intolerable, for example. So you've always got to keep an open mind to modifying things later on. But fundamentally, yes, I think we and hopefully the athletes feel really confident now in the fact that they've got a really solid, good data point from Kona in the bag, which then puts them in a more powerful position to be more confident in knowing where they're going to start from next year.
Yeah. Do you have any final take-home message for age groupers that are planning on racing Kona at some point? That's something they should take into consideration for when that time comes with regard to carbohydrates, fluid, and sodium intake?
I just think it's kind of an obvious statement to say, but with the heat and humidity, then exposing yourself to other races, or at least some periods of training in even vaguely similar conditions to figure out what you can do with sodium and fluid replacement, is going to be really, really important to success. We've definitely worked with a few athletes there in the past who have exceptionally high sweat rates and or exceptionally high rates of sodium loss, who have just consistently struggled in Kona because of the mismatch. They can do well in cooler conditions, but can't do as well in really hot conditions. And I think, starting to uncover whether you're likely to be someone who's going to need extra attention to detail in that space, that's probably one of the biggest variables that differs in that race from any other. And so being on top of that in advance and getting some experience in those conditions is critical.
Yeah. So let's move on to 73 Worlds. That was a very different climate, very different conditions, especially this year with the very unusual cold weather conditions that we had on both race days. First, just any overall observations from your side. You weren't present personally in St. George, but did you have any observations that you got from watching it from afar, or from that your team relayed to you about how the different conditions impacted the strategies that the athletes used there?
Yeah, Brad from our team, who works closely with our ambassador athletes, was out there, and one observation that he and I definitely made that was just across the board, and even at the pro level, athletes generally, not just nutritionally, but generally weren't well prepared for racing in those cooler conditions, those cold conditions that were close to sort of low single digits in Celsius. And I think we saw that if you watch the coverage in the clothing choices, and, even Emma, who we were working closely with, who got third in the end, she rode the bike ride with one glove on because she couldn't get a glove on in transition. And we saw some really divergent approaches in clothing. Lots of people wearing, people who have got multi-$1,000 kit sponsors, stuff, wearing bin bags and things like that, under their clothing and stuff. And I think that just shows that how inexperienced the sport is in generally dealing with those conditions. From a nutrition and hydration perspective, the biggest thing it showed up to us was that anyone who has a strategy for that kind of racing, where a lot of their calories are going to come from liquid intake, was caught out, because you just don't want to drink very much. You don't need to drink very much fluid volume in those cold conditions because you're barely sweating. A lot of the athletes were reporting actually essentially not sweating and shivering on the bike, at which point you can't force loads of fluid in. And then if your calories are in your fluid, then your performance is likely to be impacted because you're not getting the carbohydrates in. So you and I have talked about this loads in the past, but this idea of decoupling your calorie intake from your fluid intake some of the time is really, really important. It's really important in hot conditions, because you might overload the gut with the amount of fluid and carb you want to drink if you've got all of your calories in liquid form. And in the real cold, it's the absolute opposite problem. You don't drink enough to meet your calorific needs if you're not eating some of your calories separate to drinking. And we certainly saw that with one or two people. A lot of the reports in there are more anecdotal than us having hard data on them. We have got numbers on one or two athletes, Emma in particular. But I think the general feeling was that it's, in those cold conditions, it's harder to drink your calories. It's also just harder to eat when you've got cold fingers and wearing gloves and things like that. There's multiple factors that come into play on the bike where people just don't hit their nutrition plan as well as they can.
Yeah. So Emma Pallant-Browne, for the listeners that might not be aware, she was third. Brilliant run in particular to run up into third in the closing stages of the race. You have her numbers. Can you run through them like you did with the Kona athletes?
Yes, absolutely. So Emma in the race, so she was racing for 4 hours and 10 minutes for third place. She took in 28 grams of carbohydrate per hour on average, 288 milliliters of fluid an hour, and 740 milligrams per liter of sodium. So really, really, apart from the relative sodium concentration, which is kind of irrelevant in the sense that in those cold conditions, you really don't need a lot of fluid and a lot of sodium because the sweat rate is just not there to warrant it. The numbers are all very down, on what we'd expect. Like 28 grams of carbohydrate an hour, as you know, is like really, really low.
And was that because she did she have issues with opening gels, or what was the reason for that low number?
Two things. One was that Emma's even in the days leading up to the race, we didn't necessarily expect it to be as cold, and I don't think she did, and therefore she suspected to drink a bit of a higher volume of liquid on the bike than she did. So she had quite a strong calorific drink mix on the bike, which she barely touched. And then with the gels, she did manage to take a gel on the bike, but with the glove, with cold fingers, and with with the sort of descents and the shivering, she just basically, I think, found it very, very difficult to access and found it difficult to focus on getting the nutrition in. So instead made a decision to focus on, riding as hard as she could, and taking a risk that she would be able to sustain a decent performance on the run, even though she hadn't got the calories in.
Yeah. And I think I heard her say, or maybe it was in an Instagram post, that she then got to the run and she just grabbed a lot of cups of sports drink or whatever was available and tried to get in some calories quickly on the run. So was this actually a case of she got very little calories in and carbohydrates in on the bike, and then quite a bit of those of the carbohydrates that she got was on the run? So a bit of a backloaded strategy, which is uncommon, but in this case it just ended up being the case.
Yeah, 100%. She grabbed a lot of cups of Gatorade and stuff like that on the run, and basically tried to start to make up her calorie deficit by doing that. And so the numbers we've got to work out, we're still working out the exact split based on the number of aid stations and things, but it appears that the majority of what she took in came through those aid stations on the run, and which obviously makes total sense, because if she only had a little bit of energy drink and a gel on the bike, then she at least in her mind responded well to that and managed to get some carbs in on the run. What was fascinating for me is that you would never ever advise an athlete to obviously take 28-30 grams of carbohydrate an hour for 4 hours in a world championship event or in any event of that intensity. But the fact that she was able to really sustain her performance to the end is really intriguing and really interesting, because and probably shows that when you've got such a high level of fitness, such a high level of motivation, because it's such a huge event, when other people around you are struggling a bit. We definitely saw, I think, some of the other competitors on the run were starting to find it really hard, partly due to the conditions and I think Emma did do a fantastic job, as she normally does, in terms of carb loading before the event. She always eats a lot of carbs the day before, has a very solid breakfast, and gets a gel in the last 15 minutes before she starts. All of that combines to point to the fact that you can produce a very good result sometimes without actually getting the nutrition completely optimal.
Yeah, and I'm just speculating, but maybe because when I saw her come out of the water really close to the front, much closer than I would have expected, I thought that this could be Emma's day, because of her strong bike run. Then on the bike, obviously she didn't really manage to have the day that she could be capable of, I think, and probably because of the cold. So, and that's something that can happen, that you're really cold on the bike and you just don't manage to push power. But then the flip side of that is that, maybe she didn't expend so much energy on the bike. So that helped her limit the losses of not being able to take on so much energy, that the bike power was probably quite a bit lower than it might have been in different circumstances.
Yeah, I think she definitely, I'd agree. Again, it is speculation, because I haven't seen her bike power numbers and that kind of thing. But I do feel like that, it set her up potentially to run quicker. Plus, we know that actually the temperature is coming up on the run. Emma's someone who's had more problems racing in the heat generally than anything else. And so I think cooler conditions, although they were too cold for her and most of the athletes on the bike, on the run, they were very good conditions for her as a runner. And I think that showed. The other thing that's worth mentioning as well is that Emma's one of those athletes that they're all at that level. These are the top professionals in the world. They're all very, very motivated. They're very strong and determined. But Emma is, in my view, is sort of next level for that. She is an unbelievably tenacious athlete. And I think that when we all know that phrase about mind over matter and how you can do some pretty incredible things when you really put your mind to it, I do think that this result and the opportunity to get back on the podium after quite a few years away from the podium at 70.3 Worlds meant a lot to her. And I think that sometimes you can't expect it to happen always, but sometimes you can dig really, really deep like that and produce a phenomenal result, even if other things aren't optimized around you, in the same way that we've seen plenty of times athletes have executed a spot on nutritional strategy but haven't had a good race for numerous other reasons. And so it kind of puts in perspective the fact that, because some people might say you could use it as evidence to suggest that, okay, well, you don't need to take that much energy in when you're racing and all the rest of it, which I still think is ridiculous, because the nutrition, hydration is one of the strong pillars that supports a really good performance, but it also puts in perspective where that pillar is as compared with fitness, motivation, pre-race preparation, all of those sort of things. They are all the things that make up the performance puzzle, and you can have a good performance even if all the pieces aren't quite in place sometimes. It's a case of relative weighting of those factors.
Yeah, exactly. Like Emma had a lot of other factors going for her. Like she didn't do Kona, for example. Like somebody like Lucy Charles-Barclay had done Kona 3 weeks prior. So I obviously no clue what she took or how much she took. She might have had a perfect nutrition hydration day, but she could still feel that fatigue of Kona in her legs. So yeah, there's always so many factors that go into it that it's the combination of everything really that determines your performance.
Definitely.
But what would you say that if you could do this exact same, or if Emma could do this exact same race, the same conditions again, like how would you advise her to tweak her plan? How would you advise her to change things, to be able to change things for the conditions, if at all?
More gels and chews on the bike, and a way of making them more accessible with gloves on or with cold hands. So we should have, with hindsight, come up with something that would have made it easier for her to get some solid carbohydrate calories in on the bike, whether that's like using the bigger 90-gram gels we've got with caps taken off or bike valves put on so you can just squeeze them with one hand, whether it's using energy chews that are already unwrapped and sort of like in a little box on the frame or something where there's very, very little barrier to just picking them up and putting in your mouth and eating them. That's probably a thing. Or a very, very much like more super concentrated bottle or super concentrated drink that didn't deliver as much liquid but was very, very heavy on carbohydrates would be the type of thing. A bit like the type of approach with concentrated carbohydrate drinks that elite marathon runners are taking, because they're often running in similar low single digit temperatures but wanting to get the calories in while they're moving fast.
And another question, just this one directed more towards the regular age grouper. If somebody, let's say, showed up for St. George and expected it to be quite warm, which I think would have been reasonable unless you follow the forecast anyway, and you prepared already many weeks your nutrition hydration strategy and you've trained accordingly, how do you then go about when you see a week or 5 days before the race, 4 days before the race, that, oh no, this is going to be really cold and I need to change my plan? What are the things that you would, how would you recommend that people take that changing weather conditions into account to changing their plan?
If it's going to be a lot colder than you expected, clearly expect to want and need to drink a lot less fluid volume, but expect that if you can do it, keeping up your carbohydrate intake will be beneficial. So either a shift towards more solid calories and gels or more concentrated bottles is going to be the way to go. So just expecting that, don't expect to drink anywhere near the fluid volumes that you might expect to drink in hotter or warmer conditions. And also don't plan on forcing yourself to drink high volumes just to get those calories in, because that could also backfire.
Yeah. And I think the things that you mentioned there before with practical ways of like minimizing the barriers of getting those calories in and the carbohydrates in, like removing the caps already before the race, putting them in a small box, those are important, because that can be difficult when you're out on a cold ride and you're trying to open a gel. Like it can be really difficult when your fingers are freezing. So I guess practicing those sorts of things in the days before the race as well, making sure that you get the logistics of it sorted.
100%. And then the other thing is, remember that in the cold, very few of us race triathlons in the cold very often. Those of us who live in cooler countries will have experienced a lot of bike rides and a lot of runs in cold conditions, but you're not under the same pressure at the same intensity. And the psychology of being really, really cold when you're racing is something that most of us aren't used to, and it's quite difficult to come to terms with. When you're getting too hot, that is also difficult, but we're kind of more used to that and more geared up for it, and I guess in some ways psychologically geared up to expect it and deal with it. In the cold, it can really sap your morale, and it can really sap your determination. And I think recognizing that even if you get cold, you've got to keep pushing, you've got to keep because it'll help keep your body temperature up, and you've got to keep focusing on things like your nutrition. It's really easy for low morale to then reduce your motivation to eat and drink, and sort of you can start to feel quite negative about the whole racing experience. And whilst that's tricky to negate, I think if you go into a cold race understanding that that's something that might happen, especially if you can get around that a little bit by getting your clothing choices right, but understanding that the cold is going to sap your morale and steeling yourself to deal with that is probably also quite important, I would say.
Yeah, great point. Do you have any other observations from St. George or general observations from both of these championship races?
The only other one from St. George really was on Emma and the low carb intake, was her recovery, because a lot of the research that's been done on higher carb intakes has looked at it in the context of how it affects recovery. And it was notable, I think, that Emma reported that her recovery post-race, she said she was a lot more stiff and sore, which could be partly attributable to the hills in St. George and partly attributable to the cold, but also I think is probably partly attributable to the low carb intake. And it's one of those reasons why we'd say that, look, we always say, look, training with a low carb intake is likely to be sort of detrimental to performance and recovery, especially. And I think that's probably something else that highlights that she dug very deep with very little energy intake there, and I'm sure that will have impacted her recovery. Not that it matters so much after a championship race if you're not building up to something again straight away, but it's probably another note of caution to anyone who thinks.
Well, I think I just checked some start lists this morning, and I think Emma is on the start list for 713 Mossel Bay. I believe it's in not too long. So
yeah. Well, she'll have to bounce back. She'll have to bounce back more quickly than I thought, maybe. But certainly, using that as context for anyone who's sort of thinking, well, if you can get by on less energy intake, why would you take more? Well, I'd say, remembering that recovery is also part of the process, and one of the reasons why you might take a little bit more is also important in that context.
Yeah, and I have a good interview on that topic with some scientific research with Dr. Aitor Viribai, who did a lot of research with on that specific topic, and I'll link to that episode. I can't remember the number in the show notes, but for listeners that are interested, they can go and have a listen to that one. But that's a great point. Anything else, Andy? Anything new from Precision Fuel and Hydration that you want to mention before we sign off?
No, well, I suppose I touched on it, but one exciting new project we've got in the pipeline is that we're helping to support a PhD student at the University of Bedfordshire very soon that's starting out to look at fluid and sodium ingestion in different environmental conditions for supporting ultra endurance performance. And I think that's a 3-year project, so it's going to take some time for us to learn a lot of actionable stuff from it, but we're really excited about that, and we will be putting out some for anyone who's based in the UK who's an endurance athlete who's interested. We will be putting things out in the future as opportunities to come and take part in research studies there. So we'll be looking for triathletes, runners and cyclists, people that are fit enough to do 4 and 5 hour training sessions in a heat chamber at 30 degrees with varying levels of fluid and sodium ingestion. If people get involved in that, they'll have the opportunity to have sweat tests done to learn a lot about their physiology. There'll usually be VO2 max and lactate tests involved in picking participants, so they'll get data back from that. So I think watch our website and our newsletter on our website, that you can sign up for on our website for updates on that kind of stuff, if that piques your interest.
That's exciting news, definitely, and looking forward to following that project. Thank you so much, Andy. It was great to chat as always, and hope to chat to you again soon.
Definitely. Yeah, take it easy, Michael, and I'll chat to you again soon.
I hope that you enjoyed that interview. As always, you can find the show notes on scientifictriathlon.com, where I will have links to the case studies that are available on precision fuel and hydration. They include Leon Chevalier, Fenella Langridge, and Sarah Crowley from Kona. And I think those are the ones that at the moment of recording this anyway are available. But be sure to also follow Precision Fuel and Hydration on Instagram or Twitter, because they tend to post case studies and numbers from athletes there on the social media outlets that they have. So if you're interested in this type of content and seeing what the best in the world are doing with regard to nutrition and hydration, then that's a great way to get some more information and get some case studies around that. We mentioned an interview that I did in the past with Aitor Virbay Morales. I think now he's Dr. Aitor Virbay Morales, and about high carbohydrate intake and how that can impact recovery muscle damage. So I will link to that. That was episode 269. Very well worth a listen. And I want to give a quick update on our 2 scientific triathlon training camps that we have planned for 2023. The Algarve training camp in January is now sold out, but there are still slots available for our flagship camp in Mallorca at the end of March. So check out all of the information about this camp on our website, scientifictriathlon.com, and email me if you want to learn more or if you want to register. It will be an amazing week of training. Mallorca is just a fantastic place for cycling and for training. There are some stunning climbs, stunning landscapes and views, and great roads. So don't miss this opportunity to come and train with a bunch of like-minded people and build some great fitness ahead of your 2023 season. Finally, big thanks to our sponsors, Precision Fuel and Hydration, that you can find on precisionfuelandhydration.com. Remember to take advantage of their Black Friday campaign with 20% off everything in store between the 24th of November until midnight on Cyber Monday. No code is required. The discount is automatically applied site-wide on precisionfuelandhydration.com. Of course, this means that that triathlon show code won't be tracked, but if you want to, feel free to send them an email telling them that you came from that triathlon show. That always helps. And thank you to Roka, that you can find on roka.com. Check out their wetsuits, tri-suits, swimskins, goggles, and exceptional sunglasses and prescription glasses for everything from day-to-day wear to extreme action sports. Use the promo code that you can get on roka.com/TTS to get 20% off your entire Roka order. Thank you, as always, for listening. Keep training smart and keep loving triathlon.